Welcome to part 2 of the Narrative Tradition podcast with spotlight on Sharon K. Ball. Let's pick up right where we left off and continue this great conversation.
I'm happy you're both here providing leadership in the Enneagram world, and just want to acknowledge you both in that regard. And of course, Jeanette and I go back a long ways, and so I've known her for quite a while. But Sharon, meeting you has been relatively newer, and I just want to say that I think it's kind of. I actually said this. Renee asked for a recommendation of the book, right, which I was happy to do. And it was kind of surprising to me how you both came in with something very important. A whole area of working with people, healing, the healing work, and you again combine that with the Enneagram. That the Enneagram could take this body of work that you know very well, right? Because you've been a therapist a long time. You've been on the front lines in terms of natural disasters. You really have been out there working with people with trauma. So you know this stuff. And so I think you have a lot to teach us about trauma. And then when you combine that with the Enneagram, those of us that know the Enneagram and know our Enneagram type can kind of go, oh, I can see how it gets specific to me. In other words, what are my strengths? What are my vulnerabilities? And, how can I apply this a little more based on my Enneagram type? And of course, it's not all about Enneagram type, and you've already mentioned that. But once again, the Enneagram, of course, can help, by taking something a very powerful method of healing and help us, kind of adapt it more specifically for our situation, and our character structure. So I really appreciate that. And I'm just interested the way you organized the book was very interesting to me, right? It's a book on trauma with the Enneagram added in, rather than an Enneagram book that says, okay, here's how you can, work with trauma, which I thought was, and it seems to work very well. I'm appreciating that.
Good.
We got a lot of Enneagram books, but this was something new and something that makes a real contribution. And I of course, was reading your book and learning more about trauma and thinking about how it applied to me and what my resources were as a type 8 and what my vulnerabilities were as a type 8. And so it really helped me connect with trauma and the way you laid out the different kinds of trauma, which I thought was really helpful. So,
Yes, when we were looking at the organization of the book, again, we kept coming back to what do we know and what has science behind it, which is there's a lot of research on trauma. And, we can highlight theories like we do highlight the polyvagal theory. It's a theory, the Enneagram in theory, right? We know these things work, but we don't have a lot of there's not as much science and research behind them as much as there is with trauma and what it does to your body, from a scientific perspective. So I think for us, it was if anyone picks up the book and all they learn is that they've gone through a trauma, they're not alone, they can recognize it, they can get to safety if it's a safety issue, and they know the basics of what they need to get on the road to healing, fantastic. They don't have to learn about the Enneagram. Would it be great for them? Yes, most definitely. So we're going to show them how they can make it more individualized, their recovery. But we really wanted, because I think there's a lack of knowledge around the world on trauma and how it impacts you. And when you simply just don't recognize it, then you lose connection with the people around you. And if we're going to be a better connected world, then we have to recognize if we've been traumatized, work and access our personal agency so we can reconnect with people.
right. And there's so much trauma in human history. It's interesting that you mentioned that. When you talked about the different kinds of trauma, which I thought was terrific. You gave a little example of it. You talked about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. You talked about family violence, natural disasters, complex grief, poverty, racism, addictions, and historical trauma. I might have left something out, but these different kinds of trauma, which really open up our view on, yeah, there's different kinds, there's different levels. You talked about little t and big T trauma, and to me that just um, and wrote it well enough, by the way, wrote it very well, so that I was able to access it right away, like immediately, like it made sense. So,
Good.
I just want to congratulate you on that. I think it's just a great book, and I think anybody who wants to understand trauma, that book would work, and maybe
Mhm.
work better than some of the other more, I don't know, longer, bigger, more scientific books that are not so available to the layperson. Maybe good for the
Sure.
psychologist, perhaps, but
Yes.
for us as lay people to understand more about trauma. And I'm like, oh yeah, I get it now. Because part of me is like, well, I don't have trauma like those folks. I mean, they really have trauma, and I've never been to war, and I've never been in a natural disaster. So I mean, I can't compare. That's. But then
Mhm.
as you opened up the field, and the different versions of trauma, I'm looking at that going, yeah, in my own way, I can relate to that, how it dysregulated my system and created problems for me over a long period of time and had altered my physiology
Mm.
in many
Oh,
ways. So
yes.
But may I add in here that this is the very reason that actually you were on our bucket list, Sharon, to invite you to come to teach in the Enneagram Europe Summer School. Because with the narrative tradition, when we interview all those panels, if I learned one thing in the past 25 years, I think every person has some sort of trauma in his or her life. So that's why I think it's very interesting to also for people in the Enneagram world, Enneagram teachers, Enneagram coaches and counselors to learn more about trauma. Because I think about everybody I interview in the Enneagram panels, they share their traumas.
Mhm.
Can you tell more about your background in the trauma work? Because that's a
Sure.
big part of your work.
Yes. And as you were talking about, everyone in the Enneagram world, to me, it means no, whether you're a teacher or you're a student, practitioner, you name it, all of us have, this amazing gift that helps us relate better to other people. And that's the Enneagram. So when we're moving about our lives, if we have the knowledge of the Enneagram and we have also this base knowledge in being trauma informed, whoever you bump into, whether it's at the store, on the street, your kid's teacher, and you don't get the response that you're looking for, you can respond to them from those two beautiful ways, whether it's, from your type structure, loosening the reactivity and being more receptive to their reaction towards you. Or you can, like I do very often, give space to people who don't respond to me the way that I hope, and they're in their own reactivity. I give space to think that there could be a possibility that they've not worked through their own trauma. They've not resolved their own traumas and they are working them out on me. When I do that, I allow for more compassion in me to rise up for that person who is reactive. So you've got two beautiful ways of approaching a human if you have that knowledge. And that's where I see the trauma work being imperative for the Enneagram community because it does work hand in hand. It's added knowledge from the trauma perspective that there could be something more going on besides their type structure, how their patterns are showing up. They might be in trauma response right now.
that's so useful. I just want to say,
Okay.
I mean, that adds a lot to the Enneagram work. We've added other things to the Enneagram. Actually, the Enneagram simply is a map, right? And so we've combined it with methods over the years, and now we kind of identify them as kind of the same process. But actually, this is a big step in terms of adding helping us understand more just what you were saying, that people are often reacting out of their trauma pattern. And yes, they have an Enneagram type, but it's not only their type. It's something that's maybe amplified within their type, or maybe something that's not a reaction that we're used to associating with their type. But in any event, there's more going on here than just the, what we consider the kind of the challenge of, managing your Enneagram type and your reactivity and your patterns and all that. But the patterns are kind of like, some of the difficult patterns can be turbocharged by people's experience of trauma. And we need to know that if we're trying to work on ourselves and also, as you say, develop more compassion for the other people in our lives, that trauma does show up. And if we know that, if we can get a sense of that, an understanding of that, it's going to be a big help. And in fact, sometimes what I'm in picking up, I'm inferring this, that people with trauma need that to be specifically addressed.
Yes.
Not
Yes.
just the usual, here's how you can work on your type, which we know a lot about at this point, but there's a whole other level of healing and recovery that needs to happen based on their experience of trauma. Did I say that
Yes.
correctly?
Oh, definitely, Peter. So I'm super excited. We just became an IEA accredited school. Nine Paths is now an accredited school of the IEA. So one of our certification courses is for Enneagram practitioners who do not know about trauma, and the title is Trauma Before Type. That way they can go in and learn the science behind trauma, learn what trauma responses are before you go into that interview, to try to figure out what type the person is. You're able to discern what's a trauma response versus a pattern of their type.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's
Very, very, very interesting indeed.
yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah. So, can you share with us? We've invited you to come to teach a 3-day masterclass. And the title is Healing Trauma, Repair Relationship. What can people expect from your masterclass?
Yes. So
Why should people choose for your masterclass?
well, we've been talking about it, the last couple minutes of my passion for being trauma informed and how that works with the Enneagram. And so, how I approach it is teaching people about the story of connection, the story of protection, and the story of disconnection. And that shows up when people are in their survival state, typically as a result of an unresolved trauma or being in a traumatizing experience in the present. And I think when you walk out of the class, my hope is that when you walk out of the class, you'll be able to identify all the different types of traumas, as Peter alluded to, the big T traumas, the little t traumas, know the difference between stress and those traumas. People will be able to identify trauma responses versus type pattern behaviors and those responses. I think one of the things I get most excited about is when you recognize those differences, you'll be able to tell whether or not what can you give to that person who's experiencing those traumas. So if you're, a therapist, you'll know you can engage. If you're a coach, at what level can you help that person? When do you need to refer out? But you'll gain the knowledge for your toolbox, so you're not scared, but I have found people feel hesitant to move into conversations when people are recovering from trauma. And this class will help you not feel hesitant. You'll feel empowered. You'll know what to recognize. I throw in a lot of the polyvagal theory. So we'll talk about neuroception and how the stories we tell ourselves, we actually spin out into the world. There's stories that are all around us from our childhood, our experiences in the present, and those bounce off of the stories of another person. and we'll do more of an experiential exercise on how those show up in the face of trauma. You know, if you've unresolved stories and they're still floating around, those unresolved stories act as a filter for how you see the world. And that can impact your partner, that can impact your children, that can impact anybody you're in relationship with. So it's going to be something you can add tools to your toolbox, but I really think any person who comes to the class is going to learn and grow and might experience healing.
Yeah, I can
Well,
imagine
yeah.
that. I've been through trauma in my life. So I've never been to your class, so this is why I'm very much looking forward to it. And I can relate to what you're saying. Yeah, makes sense already.
Yeah. And I can relate too. So again, we're these
I know.
Enneagram people. We've also worked as, counselors and therapists and so on. But again, I look at my own situation and some of my clients that I can remember well, where it was really like, even 30 years ago, picking up some completely unreasonable fear triggers and anxiety in a person that was just completely out of nowhere. There was like, where in the world, what is this about? Where is it coming from? And at one point I thought, I think this is like historical trauma passed on by your grandmother who lived through the bombing raids in London during World War II and World War I. And I mean, all that trauma that went on in Europe through the different wars. And she passed that on to your mother, and that came right through the body. We talk about how the family body, and particularly the role of the importance of the mothering, and of course when the mother or the parent or fathers too are holding trauma, that can infiltrate our own physiology and not be, and again, it's confusing because like, well, wait a minute, what is this? Understanding trauma helps us get that, things can actually be passed down through generations.
Yes.
And of course, there's been some research on this in terms of, grandchildren of people who were involved in the Holocaust, Jewish families and what that did to their physiology. They were not part of the Holocaust, but their parents and their grandparents were, you know. And so, anyway, I didn't experience anything like that, but I can still see how trauma was passed along in my own experience and also my clients.
Mhm. When I hear you talk, I think this is perhaps one of the best things we can give to our children, to heal
Mm,
ourselves first.
Right.
definitely.
And
And
it, and
Peter,
it occurred, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, Peter, you're talking about epigenetics, the study of epigenetics, and
Right.
it's passed down through DNA and it through our genes, the traumas that we carry. And then how do you find the courage in your family system to see that and help empower our children to not repeat what has been passed down to them?
Right. Yeah. And of course, it intersects with the Enneagram in at least a couple ways that I notice. One is that it's kind of it combines with our type structure, right? So we may be acting it out in some way. Maybe not like the big T trauma, which
Right.
maybe is kind of cuts across all the types because it's such a big, overwhelming experience. But the small T trauma, I mean, it shows up in the type structure. So for me as an 8, it's going to, and it did amplify my anger and my aggression as a young person. And it was like, well, where's all this coming from? Well, I kind of knew at the time, but so that's one aspect. And also in terms of healing trauma, I experienced this, and I'd like to hear your comment about it, is my type structure resisted going there. So in a way, my type structure was the resistance in my defense system to actually getting down to that and healing that, because I needed to be strong and, didn't want to be vulnerable. And, I mean, so anyway, so the type structure can get in the way of actually getting to the healing that we need.
Definitely. And those are the vulnerabilities, when you develop a strong, independent, autonomous outlook on life, when you go through something that is traumatic, then you dig deeper and you don't need the help. you don't want the compassion. Because it's what has helped you survive for so long. And I think, two sides to every coin, that's where in helping the client to see how that there's a balance and how, being autonomous, independent, and strong can help you move through and find resolution, and at the same time can actually hurt you, can hold you back if you don't allow yourself to move through and receive help. And Peter, with that, that makes me just think of co-regulation. It is so hard for any human to really heal from trauma without another human walking beside them, co-regulating, helping with the nervous system. And I think each type shows up differently in what they need for co-regulation. But we all have a nervous system that gets disrupted and wants to disconnect us from the person walking beside us in our own different ways. For me, it was just getting into the doing. I didn't need help. I didn't want help. I'm just going to do it on my own, try harder. So anybody who stepped alongside me, it's kind of refusing it, but that's actually the very thing that I need. That was the medicine was to receive some of that. And I think, yeah, co-regulation is very hard to do. And that's one of the key points in the process of healing. That's where trust is developed.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Certainly been my experience.
It's an interesting topic, and it's, I just think we don't talk about it enough. I think there's still some taboo around mental health and taking care of ourselves and talking about traumas, and in some family systems can be secretive about what they've been through. So then like Peter was talking about, working with people and you just know that there's a fear there, but nobody's spoken about it. And I think the more we talk about it, it brings it from out here and right here in front of us. Let's just have a conversation.
And
Let's,
the conversation goes a little, I mean, a good conversation implies a physiological connection and the beginning
yes,
of co-regulation and the healing process with someone walking next to you. I mean, you say very clearly in your book, I appreciate this because, I have a background as a body therapist, and you say, well, it takes more than talk therapy.
yes,
And then you talk about, combining movement as well as mindfulness, and you give a lot of practices. It's very, I mean, you have a lot of things that people can do. You have a lot of practices in the book too, and so that combination of, I mean, yes, it's important to talk, and it's important to understand things from a psychological framework, and at the same time, it requires some emotional, physical healing as well, because that's where the trauma is lodged, obviously, is in our body as well as our psyche.
yes. Yes, and that's the beauty of the three centers, being able to engage the body, the heart, and the mind all together. And I don't believe, in my experience, I don't think there's any cookie cutter way for somebody to go through their resolution of trauma. There are some key pillars that they need along the way, but you do definitely, I mean, if we think about it, there probably all of us have had times where you've had a body experience that has resolved some hurt or pain. It hasn't been through talking it out. It hasn't been through trying to analyze it. I can recall one time just coming back from I went to Sri Lanka for the tsunami, and we got stuck in Mumbai, and we had been without showers for like 5 days. And they had in the airport these porta showers that you could get in there and clean off, but it wasn't like a big shower. It was kind of like wet your towel, try to get all the dirt. I came back with caked on dirt all over my face, and I can remember just wiping off my face and feeling just a little bit of the warm water, and I just sobbed. I just sobbed, just cried for all that I had seen, all the pain, the children, the devastation of their land. And my friend and we didn't I mean, I don't know how long the flight was back. It was an odd trip getting back, but we didn't even have the words to say. There was nothing we could say but me literally washing and having that physical experience of just crying, and it moved something in my body that words could not do. Um,
Well, that's great that you were willing to do that. And I think that's what we all need to be reminded of, that there is at some point a release that can happen in our emotional expression and through our body, and sometimes through shaking and crying, and and that's absolutely necessary. And of course, people get stuck there. You know what I mean? They don't want to, they don't understand the importance of that release, or they don't. It's just sometimes in the body there's just too much holding, too much hold, kind of historical holding patterns, and I mean. It's just, people might even say, well, I'm willing to express my feelings, but I can't. The body armor is closing down and preventing me from actually giving a voice or letting go to that experience. So,
yeah. Which we have to be grateful for. That's part of what I teach is there needs to be gratitude for what the body does for us as a protection. And it's going to be the last part of you that actually believes you're safe. So it's always the first that will hold captive all of those memories, lodge all of those memories, because it does not want you to experience what you've gone through again. And so when you can find a conduit to release that in whatever way through the body, it's finally the body believing, hey, okay, you're safe now. We can work through this. And I always really try to challenge myself to hold judgment. Don't judge another person's experience in how they're working through their trauma, because that body perspective or the body intelligence is what's keeping them safe.
right, got it. Thank you.
And from my personal story, I can share that when I hear you explain this, Sharon, that actually also my body was like in the healing process, where I really had like pain in my body, but during the day I was okay. But then during the night, it felt like pain, like almost on the cell level of my cells. How do you say it? So it feels like really deep down a body ache. So, but on the one hand, I was like, okay, how can I heal myself from this? But at the other side, I was like, okay, I knew I was already very much on my healing path, very far on my healing path. And then the next step was to really take good care of my body and me. That's what my body was telling me. Yeah. Yeah. So mentally, emotionally, I was already okay, quite okay, but my body was still aching during the night.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
yeah. So, anything else that it's important to cover before we wrap up here for this conversation? I think we've heard a lot. We've said a lot. We've
Yes,
heard a lot. I appreciate it. And again, I mean, uh, it's an uncomfortable subject.
it is.
I'll
And we
just
don't
say
get to
that. I
laugh a
mean, I'm
lot when we're
not
talking about trauma.
terribly uncomfortable because I've been here before, and yet I can feel the kind of oh yeah, right, and all that trauma. And I work through a fair amount, but I still have some. I can tell. I mean, it's a very, so that will create some resistance in people. It certainly would create some resistance in me, and I know better. So I just want to point that out. And of course, you're very encouraging and you're very caring, and that of course is a big help. I mean, you are communicating that there's path where safety can be developed, and that safety developed in conjunction with others, and particularly maybe a trauma therapist. And then from there is a path for recovery. And I think that's a very positive message and a very hopeful message. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And I think since we've all been through trauma and healed ourselves on that path, I think the how do you say, the positive side of it is because you've been through it yourself. I can relate to when you say, hey, you became a better therapist. I became better in my work too, because you've been there, and now you're able to be there for others who go through it. Yeah.
And I think it's through people talking about it, it gives hope to other people. There is a path, as Peter said. And Jeanette, as you said, more than likely everybody's gone through some level of trauma. Whether it's little t or big T, we're kind of all in this together. And, I really believe if the world resolved their traumas, we probably would be better connected. It's in our traumas that we disconnect from people. And we put up that we tell our stories of the need of protection, which we do. So it's important that we resolve it so we can kind of find the come full circle moment. Because I do think people come closer together when they can live out of their healed self. Yeah. This has been great though.
Yeah.
It's so hard for me because I feel like the topics that I talk about are so heavy. And, it's kind of like when I get on a plane and somebody asks me what I do, I have a couple choices in that moment. Do I want to tell them that I'm a therapist? Do I even want to tell them I'm a trauma therapist? Or do I just go, I do consulting and business, depending upon, the feel that I get from the person who asks. It's either going to be a really heavy conversation or they're just going to turn me off. They're going to say, oh, nope, don't want to talk about that. And I think that I have to remind myself, it's a topic that is heavy and it is hard to talk about. Yet, when people do heal, then that's when life comes back into them. And science tells us that the first thing that goes out, or that a person loses in their life is the gift of laughter when they're in a trauma experience or trying to recover, because laughter is pretty much like a luxury when you're going through that experience and you don't have time to feel the good stuff. So my hope is really that people learn from, conversations like this and know that they can kind of come back and find their life, the full, embodied life that is both involves everything, the positives and the negatives.
Well,
I love those words. I don't know exactly how you say it, that when after the healing, the life comes back. Yeah. Well,
okay.
really nice words. Thank you for this, Sharon.
Thank you
Yes.
for sharing
Well,
that.
and I'm so excited to be with you all this summer. So thank you for having me join.
I think then, well, I think it was a very amazing conversation. I mean, I'm very sure also for everybody watching and listening, and I want to thank everybody watching and listening to this episode of the Narrative Tradition podcast. Thank you again for being with us, Sharon, and sharing this all with us.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye.